The silence before the storm, it is not empty. It hums with the heavy weight of a life defined by conflict, a peculiar consuming need that draws the commander back to the razor's edge. What happens when the grand, noble pursuit of purpose finds its only brutal expression in the rhythm of battle? This hour, we journey into the inner lives of 20 commanders, men and women who found in war an ultimate, yet fleeting source of meaning. Let the echoes of their struggle be the soothing sound that guides your mind to rest as we explore the psychological gravity that pulls a general back to the fight again and again. The void of peace, Alexander the Great. The arid dust of the Persian plain, late afternoon. Alexander stands, not surveying the defeated army, but gazing eastward, his eyes empty of the triumph of the moment. The exhilaration of conquest is a high that dissipates instantly, replaced not by satisfaction, but by a sudden terrifying void. The world, once a massive challenge, now shrinks around him. This is the moment the pursuit of glory morphs into something darker, a desperate psychological need to fill the terrifying silence that peace brings. For Alexander, the notion of being an ordinary man was a psychological threat greater than any army. His identity was fused with his exceptionalism, his role as the world changer. To stop fighting, to settle down, was to accept mediocrity, a fate his entire being rebelled against. The idea of the next distant territory provided a crucial defense mechanism against the crippling fear of stagnation, turning his ambition into an emotional survival strategy. The war machine was not merely a tool of the state, it was the engine of his ego. The logistics of endless war also provided a necessary distraction. The intricate daily demands of feeding, moving, and motivating an enormous force left no time for introspection. This constant, high-stakes problem-solving offered a kind of structured meaning, a predictable routine within an unpredictable world. It was a cognitive addiction, a mind accustomed to operating at peak efficiency, which found the complexities of civilian life tedious and incomprehensible. His mind, honed for the immediate demands of the battlefield, had lost the capacity for simple contentment. This relentless cycle became his psychological prison. Each victory only amplified the stakes for the next, forcing him to keep moving just to maintain the illusion of control. He was pursuing an ever-receding horizon of ultimate achievement, a perfect, final conquest that would grant him the peace he craved. Yet peace could only come from within, a landscape he had deliberately left barren. He sought external validation through endless conflict, unaware that the void he feared was a part of himself. Alexander's life whispers the painful truth. Meaning found in external expansion is fundamentally unstable. The constant drive to conquer the world was ultimately a failed attempt to conquer the self. His ambition was not a glorious freedom, but a form of psychological slavery, a ceaseless, restless wandering across the earth in search of a quiet he had already destroyed within. His legacy is etched not just in lands won, but in the emptiness of an achievement that could never be enough. The comfort of the map, Julius Caesar. A drafty tent in Gaul, candlelight flickering over campaign maps. Rome, for Julius Caesar, was a suffocating labyrinth of debt and political betrayal. The battlefield offered a stark, beautiful contrast. Clear rules, absolute authority, and quantifiable results. War was his great psychological escape, a place where he could transmute the messy, unpredictable chaos of civilian life into the clean, geometric logic of strategy. The legions offered a loyalty no politician could match. The emotional energy he poured into navigating the Senate's petty grievances was redirected toward the precise logistics of conquest. Each campaign was a mental exercise, a complex puzzle that rewarded pure intellect and will. This relentless focus on control became an anchor. The addiction was not just to victory, but to the process, the quiet hours spent with charts and reconnaissance reports, creating an order out of the wildlands that he could never impose on his turbulent political home city. When the letters from Rome arrived, detailing Cicero's latest speech or Pompey's growing influence, Caesar felt a consuming sense of helplessness. In Gaul, however, he was the sovereign architect of his own reality. Every decision had immediate, measurable consequences, providing a visceral feedback loop that validated his self-worth. It was a potent psychological drug, the feeling of absolute competence, the sheer power of making history with every dictated command, far away from the petty demands of creditors. The long years away from Rome hardened his resolve, but also sealed his emotional fate. He found a deeper connection with the hardened soldiers who followed him than with the elegant citizens who judged him. The bonds of shared danger were real. The promises of politicians were air. He needed the war to maintain this sense of authentic belonging, a fellowship forged in iron and hardship that gave his life a clear, uncompromising meaning. Caesar's return across the Rubicon was not just a political act, it was a psychological inevitability. He was a man who had become incapable of existing without the clarity of conflict. He could no longer tolerate the messy ambiguity of peacetime power sharing. The map of Gaul, with its neat lines of advance and retreat, had become the map of his soul, demanding the same logical, decisive conquest of his own country. He sought meaning in the final, ultimate game of control, which ultimately led to the final, ultimate loss of his own life. The Weight of Expectation, George S. Patton. A dusty training field in Texas, the smell of canvas and leather hanging heavy in the air. For Patton, the martial identity was not chosen. It was inherited, a generational suit of armour he was born to wear. His pursuit of war was initially the relentless pursuit of his ancestors' approval, a crippling fear of failure disguised as bold aggression. He felt he had to constantly perform, to be the living embodiment of the warrior ideal, to earn the very name he carried. This pressure created an internal split, a quiet, sensitive man with intellectual curiosity trapped within the persona of a flamboyant, hyper-aggressive general. The violence of war became a necessary tool to manage this dissonance. Every flamboyant gesture, every dramatic speech, was a performance designed to solidify the role, to drown out the internal whisper of doubt. The battlefield was the only stage where this persona achieved total, unquestionable validity. Patton's fascination with reincarnation and ancient battles was another layer of this psychological defense. By believing he was a warrior reborn, he gave himself permission to embrace the role completely, absolving himself of the modern world's judgment. This search for meaning across lifetimes was a powerful sedative for the anxiety of his present-day command. It made the immense destruction around him feel less final, less tragic, as if it were all part of an endless, glorious epic. He was addicted to the emotional clarity that extreme danger brought. In the heat of battle, all the complexities of politics, personal flaws and introspection vanished. There was only the objective: advance, flank, conquer. This stark, urgent simplicity was a relief for a mind constantly churning with self-criticism. War, for Patton, was the ultimate form of attention control, forcing his focus outward onto the enemy rather than inward onto his anxieties. Yet, when the guns fell silent, the inner critic returned with a vengeance. Post-war Europe was a frustrating, non-martial landscape that offered no place for his persona. He yearned for the return of the dramatic, clear-cut conflict, because it was the only scenario in which he felt truly himself. His outbursts and professional missteps after the surrender were the tragic result of an identity forged entirely in the furnace of war, now unable to survive the cooling touch of peace. The high of the charge, Hannibal Barca. The brutal, lonely pass of the Alps, the air thin and cold. Hannibal's journey was defined by an initial trauma, the childhood oath sworn to his father, a vow of eternal hatred for Rome. This wasn't merely a political objective, it was a deeply ingrained psychological program, a binding contract that gave his life its singular, uncompromising meaning. His military career was the only way to fulfill this emotional debt. The addiction of Hannibal was to the impossible victory. The sheer audacity of crossing the Alps, the triumph at Cannae. These were not just strategic successes, but moments of intense, visceral self-validation. The feeling of outwitting a vastly superior enemy, of bending reality to his will, provided an unparalleled euphoria. This high, born of genius and risk, was what he constantly chased, needing to prove his exceptionalism with every impossible maneuver. However, this reliance on peak performance left him unable to adapt to the tedious, drawn-out grind of a political siege. After Cannae, Rome refused to engage on his terms, forcing him into a slow, draining war of attrition. Hannibal could win battles, but he struggled with the patience required to win a war built on logistics and politics. His psychological need for the immediate dramatic climax meant he could not handle the emotional lull of waiting. His commitment to the oath prevented any viable retreat or compromise. His identity was so intertwined with the fight against Rome that ending it, short of total victory, meant the complete psychological dissolution of self. He found meaning only in the perpetual state of conflict, becoming a refugee general for years, kept alive by the sheer stubborn purity of his mission. His purpose was simple, direct, and non-negotiable. Hannibal's tragic end, hunted across continents, reflects the inescapable pull of a life defined by a single obsession. He could not stop fighting because the fight was his life. He sought the final, perfect moment of victory to justify the decades of sacrifice, but the addiction meant he was structurally incapable of ever achieving the peace that would render his mission complete. He died in exile, unable to stop the war within, even after the one outside had ended. The fear of silence. Subutai, Mongol general. The endless, echoing silence of the Eurasian steppe at midnight. Subutai was the ultimate soldier of motion, and his addiction was to the velocity of command. For the Mongols, stopping meant dying. Movement was life, sustenance, and strategy. The psychological security of the Mongol horde was in its relentless forward momentum. The fear of silence for Subutai was the fear of death, of becoming vulnerable, of losing the advantage. His genius was in the constant, high-stakes logistical planning. The sheer magnitude of moving an army across vast distances, conquering disparate cultures, and keeping his forces supplied provided an unmatched mental stimulant. This continuous, complex problem-solving was his primary source of meaning. It was a game of total logistics, and the rewards were literal empires. Peace to Subutai was an inefficient, disorganized waste of time. The psychological bond with his cavalry was absolute, a powerful sense of collective purpose rarely found in stationary societies. Every day of the campaign reinforced this connection, making the army his true home, the only place he felt safe and understood. The relentless campaigning solidified his identity not as a ruler, but as a perpetual instrument of the Khan's will, a clear, unambiguous role that brought great comfort. When the campaign paused, anxiety settled in. The vast, empty steppe became a mirror, reflecting his own isolation and the terrifying lack of structure that civilian life represented. He would immediately begin planning the next move, the next invasion, not necessarily out of aggression, but to re-establish the psychological safety of routine and motion. The addiction was the need to maintain the flow state that came only with command and conquest. Subutai died in his tent, not on the battlefield, but only after decades of continuous campaigning. He had successfully outrun the silence for his entire adult life. His final rest was only achieved when his physical body failed, demonstrating the profound difficulty of relinquishing a life completely defined by the chase. His legacy is one of unstoppable motion, a man who found his ultimate purpose in the act of forever moving forward. The architect of chaos, Napoleon Bonaparte. A lavish yet cold imperial palace room, the sounds of Paris muffled outside. Napoleon's addiction was to the creation of his own reality. Born with immense talent but limited prospects, he seized the chaos of the French Revolution as his opportunity to redefine the possible. His military campaigns were the ultimate form of self-expression, a titanic historical sculpture carved with armies and nations. He could not stop fighting because the world was merely a canvas for his will. His need for conflict was rooted in grandiosity, the absolute unwavering belief that he was destined for a singular role in human history. Every tactical maneuver, every treaty, every crowning was meticulously orchestrated to reinforce this self-concept. The war provided him with immediate, irrefutable evidence of his genius, validating a self-worth that was otherwise contingent on the fluctuating opinions of men. The power of command was a constant affirmation. The psychological benefit of endless war was the speed of execution. In a bureaucracy, plans are delayed. On the battlefield, Napoleon's will became instant law. This immediate feedback loop of action and consequence fed his need for control. He was addicted to the total efficiency of military command, where 1,000 decisions could be made in an hour, resulting in dramatic, world-altering effects. Peace, by contrast, was slow, cumbersome, and frustrating. This relentless drive was deeply isolating. The higher he climbed, the more enemies he created, and the more dependent he became on his military bubble. The army was the only institution that truly understood and enabled his ambition. He was trapped by the very empire he created, unable to transition to a peaceful ruler, because the source of his identity was the conqueror. To rule in peace would have been to admit his final form was achieved, which his restless mind could never accept. The final tragic march to Moscow was a desperate attempt to find a challenge worthy of his continued existence, a new frontier to confirm his eternal meaning. Even in exile on Elba, his mind immediately gravitated to the next campaign. His life proved that when a person's identity is built solely on the external act of dominating the world, the cessation of that act is tantamount to psychological death. His final years were spent obsessively chronicling a greatness he could no longer actively possess. The Loss of Self, Robert E. Lee. A quiet garden in Virginia, the scent of magnolias and regret. Robert E. Lee's struggle was not driven by the glory of war, but by a consuming conflict between his personal moral code and his profound, localized sense of duty. His addiction was to the virtue of sacrifice, finding ultimate meaning in the self-denial required to fulfill what he perceived as his obligation to his native state. He chose the battlefield as a stage for his honor, not his ambition. The war gave Lee a clear, ethical imperative: to protect his home. This external, desperate need created a moral shield, allowing him to compartmentalize the national betrayal from his personal conviction. The relentless pressure of command provided a powerful, constant focus that prevented him from fully confronting the inner trauma of his choice. He channeled all his anguish into the single, pure pursuit of military excellence. His psychological journey was one of progressive self-effacement. He became the calm, austere symbol of his army, projecting an unwavering resolve that was often a defense against his own internal despair. The meaning he sought was not in victory, but in the perfection of his duty, sacrificing his personal comfort, his fortune, and eventually his cause to maintain an impossible standard of conduct. The war became his religious calling, a spiritual test of his character. As the war turned against the Confederacy, Lee's resolve did not break, but hardened. He fought harder, not in hope of success, but to fulfill his commitment to the bitter end. The fight itself became his only remaining identity. To surrender was not just a military failure, it was a profound personal and moral failure to meet the standard of sacrifice he had set for himself. This made the act of ceasing the war almost unbearable. After Appomattox, the emotional residue of the conflict was immense. Lee spent his final years seeking to heal the ravaged lands and souls of his people, finding a new, quiet purpose in education. He fought one final battle, the battle for reconciliation and restraint. His story teaches that addiction to war can be rooted in the most noble of concepts, duty, and that the path to peace is often a long, painful effort to redefine one's meaning without the clarity of conflict. The Intimacy of Danger, T.E. Lawrence. A remote Bedouin encampment, firelight playing across the desert sand. T.E. Lawrence's addiction was not to the command of men, but to the intensity of the desert. He found in the physical hardship and the extreme intimacy of guerrilla warfare a psychological escape from the suffocating expectations and emotional restraints of his own culture. The desert was an uncompromising environment that stripped away the mask of the self. His psychological reward was the forging of deep, intense and transient bonds with his fellow fighters. These were connections based not on class or manners, but on shared danger and absolute trust. This raw, immediate fellowship was the meaning he was truly seeking, a feeling of belonging that he could never achieve within the rigid structure of British society. The war provided the necessary crucible for this authentic connection. Lawrence often expressed a profound aversion to physical and political power, yet he was masterful at both. This inner conflict fueled his constant need for self-abasement and risk. He was addicted to the limit experience, the mental and physical push to the absolute edge, because it silenced the internal chatter of self-doubt and intellectual insecurity. Only in the most extreme, dangerous moments did he feel a profound sense of clarity. When the Arab revolt succeeded, the subsequent political manoeuvring in Paris and London was a psychological poison. He found the civilian world to be dishonest, hypocritical, and tedious. His mind, honed for the immediate existential truths of the desert, could not tolerate the slow, bureaucratic lies of diplomacy. This disillusionment created a powerful desire to return to the simple, unambiguous reality of the fight. Lawrence's later years were marked by a desperate self-destructive attempt to disappear into the anonymity of the ranks, trading his fame for the repetitive, disciplined structure of military life. He could not stop seeking the psychological safety found in relinquishing command and simply being a soldier. He died seeking a final, private escape from the burden of his own legend, a man forever addicted to the stark, beautiful purity of the desert war. The quest for the pure moment, Sun Tzu, a silent, misty riverside bamboo grove, the ink dark on a scroll. Sun Tzu's addiction was of a purely intellectual nature, the pursuit of perfection in the art of conflict. His goal was not the bloodlust of the charge, but the aesthetic beauty of the bloodless victory. He sought to create a system so flawless, so comprehensive, that the enemy's will would break before a single arrow was loosed. His war was fought entirely within the parameters of the mind. For Sun Tzu, the battlefield was the ultimate laboratory for studying human psychology and power dynamics. The conflict provided him with the most profound, high-stakes material for his philosophical project, the mapping of human behavior under duress. He was addicted to the puzzle, the intellectual challenge of imposing total order and predictability onto the most volatile of human endeavours. This cognitive pursuit was his ultimate source of meaning. The sheer discipline required to compose the art of war reflects an internal life dedicated to minimizing emotional chaos. He advocated for a command style that was calm, patient, and utterly detached, a projection of his own intense need for inner control. War, when waged correctly, was a reflection of the Tao, a perfect expression of balance and non-action. He was addicted to the clarity that his system provided, a refuge from the unpredictable messiness of human relationships. The psychological effect of his teachings is to turn the general into an ascetic, a monk of command who suppresses personal ambition for the sake of strategic purity. To break his own rules, to allow personal emotion to interfere, would be the greatest failure. This self-imposed restraint was a profound form of discipline, a psychological structure that prevented the emotional excesses common to other commanders. The system itself was his anchor. Sun Tzu's fate, however, suggests the profound difficulty of translating perfect theory into flawed reality. The pursuit of the pure moment of conflictless victory is ultimately an unattainable ideal. He spent his life trying to manage the unmanageable, the human heart. His legacy is the eternal quest for meaning through intellectual control, a beautiful, stark reminder that the ultimate battlefield is always the human mind, which remains tragically outside the control of any perfect strategy. The End of Retreat, Erwin Rommel. A flickering lantern in a North African bunker, the sand whispering outside. Erwin Rommel's addiction was to the immediacy of the front lines. Unlike generals who preferred the quiet of the map room, Rommel sought the visceral connection to the battle, where he could directly influence events. This need for constant forward motion was his psychological defense against the static, oppressive reality of his regime's bureaucratic control and ultimate moral decay. His style of command was rooted in a psychological need for autonomy. By staying at the forefront, he could bypass the endless political and strategic squabbles of high command. The desert offered him a clean, simple challenge. The logistics of speed and surprise against the forces of nature and the enemy. This clarity, this direct, unambiguous chain of cause and effect, was deeply rewarding to his action-oriented mind. He found meaning in the execution, not the ideology. The relentless forward drive became a psychological necessity. Retreat for Rommel was not just a military maneuver, it was a personal failure, a surrender to the inevitable. His mind was wired to find safety in aggression, believing that only by pushing onward could he maintain the fragile illusion of control over a war that was rapidly escaping him. This obsession with attack was a form of denial, a refusal to accept the limits of his resources or his situation. As the war turned, the addiction became a desperate, self-destructive pattern. He continued to plan offensives even when the tactical situation demanded consolidation, trapped by his own historical persona as the Desert Fox. The need to live up to the legend he, and the propaganda machine, had created became a paralyzing psychological constraint. He could not stop because stopping meant the legend died, and the legend was his identity. Rommel's end, forced to choose between dishonor and suicide, was the tragic conclusion of a life spent in perpetual motion. He could not transition to civilian life or political dissent because his entire sense of purpose had been invested in the relentless performance of the soldier's duty. He died a prisoner of the war he could not stop fighting, illustrating how a pure focus on military excellence can tragically blind a commander to the moral and political realities of the conflict. As we pause at the midpoint of our journey, let us reflect on the vast psychological landscape we have traversed, from the Hellenic world to the American frontier. Though separated by millennia and continent, a haunting sensory thread binds these eras together. The chill of cold steel, the low, distant rumble of a cannon, the dry electric tension of a life lived on the cusp of disaster. The eras we have visited, be it the disciplined structure of imperial Rome or the volatile, personal command of the Mongols, all placed a unique yet crushing psychological burden on the commander. War was not an abstract concept. It was a physical, inescapable reality. It demanded a constant state of hypervigilance, and that constant state became the very meaning and purpose these figures came to crave, replacing the messy needs of the civilian soul. This context is crucial. The addiction we speak of was fueled by a world that made the battlefield the only place where a man of action could truly be whole. Peace offered committees, negotiations, and political compromise, all of which require a surrender of the decisive will. But in battle, the self was immediate. validated by every calculated risk and every consequential choice. The eras themselves were complicit in this psychological dependency, offering no viable alternative. We see that the stakes were universally profoundly human. From Alexander to Rommel, the grandiosity of conquest was merely a cover for a deep personal quest to outrun mortality or to escape the crushing weight of societal expectation. The general's ambition became the ultimate form of self-medication for the anxieties of existence. The constant movement of armies was a physical manifestation of an internal, restless flight from self-reflection. The transition to the next 10 chapters is a subtle shift from the genesis of the addiction to its devastating personal cost. We now move toward the quiet tragedies, the heroes who could not put down the sword, the minds that broke under the weight of memory, and the immense psychological discipline required by the few who did manage to choose peace. The world has shifted, but the internal battle for meaning continues. In the quiet turning of the centuries, the search for true meaning remains our most profound journey. If these whispers of the past charting the inner lives of command have offered your mind a place of calm reflection, we invite you to continue the journey with us. Subscribe to The Psychological Historian and allow these tales of struggle and resolve to guide your thoughts to a peaceful stillness. By engaging with this community, you help us continue to explore the complex, enduring truths of the human condition. As we now turn to the final 10 chapters, new souls await, whose inner battles illuminate our own path to rest and purpose. The Wounds of Victory, Ulysses S. Grant. The silent, echoing halls of a post-war capital, the scent of dust and old paper. Ulysses S. Grant's addiction was not to the fight itself, but to the certainty of his purpose during the conflict. Before the war, he was a restless failure, unable to find his footing in civilian life. The Civil War offered him a clear moral objective, preserving the Union, that gave his life an unambiguous structure and meaning he had always lacked. When the war ended, the immediate need vanished, leaving a terrifying void where his identity as the saviour of the Union once stood. The psychological shock was immense. He found it difficult to transition his immense, decisive will to the ambiguous, slow-moving complexities of Reconstruction politics. The simple, direct objective of military command was replaced by the messy reality of bureaucracy, which offered no satisfying reward for competence. This vacuum of purpose led to a form of psychological withdrawal, manifest in his continued struggle with alcohol. The addiction to the fight was replaced by the addiction to the temporary oblivion that drink offered, a desperate attempt to quiet the restlessness that returned without the constant urgency of command. The profound psychological meaning he found in war was lost in the emptiness of peacetime fame. Even his presidency was, in a way, an attempt to replicate the clear-cut control of the battlefield in the realm of politics, a strategy that failed to translate. His mind had been honed by the simplicity of command, and the compromises of peace felt like moral and personal failures. He sought external affirmation through public life, attempting to re-establish the unambiguous value that his wartime successes had provided him. Grant's final years, spent writing his memoirs while battling illness and financial ruin, were a final, desperate attempt to recapture the meaning of his time in conflict. The act of writing was a last command, an effort to control the narrative and cement his contribution to the cause he so believed in. His life shows the devastating difficulty of finding a new purpose, when the ultimate moral struggle, the one that defined you, is over. The Iron Will's Fatigue, Joan of Arc. A cold stone prison cell, the sound of water dripping outside. Joan of Arc's life was the absolute fusion of self and mission. Her psychological drive was an unshakable conviction that her purpose was divinely mandated. The war was not an addiction to violence, but an addiction to the absolute clarity of her own role as a saviour. This clarity provided her with an emotional armour that was impenetrable to doubt or fear. Her psychological reward was the certainty of her self-worth. In a world that offered peasant women no power, her voices gave her absolute authority over nobles and armies. This was the ultimate validation of her existence, a clear, tangible source of meaning that no human betrayal could diminish. The battlefield was simply the necessary medium through which this divine purpose was executed. The true psychological crisis began not with a military defeat, but with her capture. Stripped of her armour, her army, and her king, she was forced into a world of religious and political ambiguity that she could not comprehend. Her relentless pursuit of truth through her voices became her final point of defence. The physical prison was nothing compared to the intellectual prison of the tribunal, which sought to dismantle the very source of her identity. She could not compromise because her conviction was the meaning of her life. To recant her voices would have been to admit that her entire existence, all the courage, all the sacrifice, was founded on a delusion. The betrayal of her king and the exhaustion of her supporters left her completely isolated, but the clarity of her internal mandate remained the one thing she could never relinquish. Joan's final, tragic refusal to break was the ultimate act of fidelity to her own sense of purpose. She chose the finality of the fire over the unbearable ambiguity of a life lived without the certainty of her mission. Her story illustrates that the addiction to a divine or ultimate purpose can be so profound that the individual is structurally unable to step away, choosing self-destruction over the psychological annihilation of losing their core belief. The betrayal of peace, Scipio Africanus. A secluded villa by the sea, the sounds of calm waves offering no comfort. Scipio Africanus's addiction was to the intense public adoration that only a hero general could receive. After defeating Hannibal and saving Rome, he returned home with a profound self-identity as the irreplaceable man of the hour. The war had provided the perfect stage for his charismatic genius and his profound need for external validation. The psychological betrayal of peace was the swift decline of that public affection and the return of political pettiness. The war was a clear contest. Peace was a murky, personal attack. He was a brilliant strategist, but a clumsy politician. The military structure rewarded his decisiveness. The Senate rewarded compromise and backbiting. He found the transition from being a national saviour to a political target to be deeply and personally insulting. His initial attempts to remain politically active were efforts to maintain his wartime level of control and influence, to keep his hands on the levers of power that made him feel whole. But Rome was tired of war heroes. It wanted civilian leaders. This rejection was experienced by Scipio not as a political setback, but as a personal and public dismissal of his very worth. The meaning he had constructed through sacrifice was being trivialized by ungrateful men. The public accusations of financial mismanagement and corruption were the final straw. Rather than fighting his political enemies in the forum, a slow, unsatisfying battle, he chose a definitive, dramatic act of retreat. He withdrew entirely from public life, retiring to his villa in voluntary exile. This was a psychological surrender, a refusal to endure a life where his heroism was no longer the ultimate currency. Scipio's final years were marked by a bitterness toward the state he had saved. He could not find meaning in the simple, quiet life because his sense of self was built on the titanic scale of his public achievements. He was addicted to the spotlight of crisis, and when the light was removed, he chose to disappear into the shadows. His exile whispers the truth that some commanders are addicted not to the fighting, but to the unparalleled self-esteem that only saving a nation can provide. The endless siege, Saladin. A watchtower at the edge of a great city, the desert wind dry and warm. Saladin's addiction was not to personal glory, but to the relentless, crushing burden of being the symbol of a unified cause. His life was a ceaseless balancing act between rival factions, political intrigue, and the ever-present Frankish threat. The war provided him with an external, unambiguous enemy that justified his internal authority and gave his complex political life a single, unifying moral purpose. He found profound meaning in the concept of jihad, not only as a religious obligation, but as a continuous political project that demanded perpetual vigilance. This commitment meant he could never fully rest or retire. His psychological reward was the sense of absolute, historical necessity, that without his presence, the entire structure of the resistance would collapse. This immense responsibility became the anchor of his self-worth. The relentless siege and counter-siege required him to live a life of profound self-control. His reputation for fairness, piety, and patience were not just virtues, they were crucial strategic tools for maintaining the fragile coalition of armies he commanded. He was addicted to this image of the noble warrior, a role he had to uphold every hour of every day. The war forced him into a state of continuous moral and physical excellence. His great challenge was the inability to differentiate between the military threat and the political. Peace with the Franks was often necessary, but it immediately brought internal dissent and challenges to his power. The only way to silence his rivals was to relaunch the conflict, proving his indispensable value to the greater Muslim world. The war became his political weapon of choice, the ultimate distraction from his domestic enemies. Saladin died exhausted, worn out by the relentless nature of the long war and the demands of his own image. He never had the luxury of a peaceful retirement. His sense of purpose was inextricably linked to the ongoing struggle. His story shows that when a commander becomes the ultimate symbol of a cause, the war becomes an addiction of necessity, a perpetual wearying requirement for maintaining both external order and internal meaning. The Masque of the General, Duke of Wellington. A fog-shrouded English country estate, the atmosphere thick with unspoken words. The Duke of Wellington's addiction was to discipline and emotional isolation. His military career was a refuge for a naturally withdrawn analytical mind that found the emotional demands of civilian life tedious and complex. The army provided him with a set of rules and an emotional distance that he could rely on. He famously stated that nothing was worse than a battle won except a battle lost. This reflected his psychological makeup. War was a necessary evil, but it offered him a place of profound competence where the rules were clear and emotion was suppressed. He was addicted to the intellectual rigor of command, where the goal was to minimize risk and achieve the objective with maximum efficiency. His control over his troops mirrored his iron control over his own feelings. The psychological cost of this emotional discipline was a profound inability to connect personally. He maintained the Masque of the General at all times, keeping people, including his own family, at a careful distance. He needed this isolation to function, viewing sentimentality as a dangerous weakness on the battlefield and in life. The war provided a constant, legitimate excuse for this detachment. When he transitioned to politics, he struggled immensely. The field was ruled by oratory, sentiment, and messy alliances, all the things his military mind rejected. He applied the methods of command to the problems of state, leading to public unpopularity and frustration. He could not adapt to a world that required emotional vulnerability and compromise because his decades in command had calcified his emotional defences. Wellington, late in life, admitted his exhaustion with the whole spectacle of fame and public life. He sought meaning in duty and structure, but the relentless demands of the world kept him from the quiet solitude he truly craved. His story is a powerful reminder that the addiction can be to the structure of command, a psychological framework that prevents a commander from having to confront the difficult, often frustrating chaos of the inner life and true peace. The Curse of Foresight, Dwight D. Eisenhower. A dimly lit map room, the radio static a low, constant hum. Dwight D. Eisenhower's addiction was to the process of alliance and coordination. Unlike the other generals, His expertise was in managing the massive complex machinery of modern war. His psychological drive was to find meaning in the collaborative act, in bringing disparate, powerful egos into a single, functional unity against a common threat. The war gave him a clear, terrifying mission: to defeat tyranny while minimizing loss of life. This provided a perfect moral focus for his managerial genius. His addiction was to the intense pressure of making decisions where the stakes were existential, finding profound validation in his ability to keep the fragile alliance together despite the constant political and military fracturing. This was a form of control achieved not through force but through diplomacy. The psychological weight, however, was immense. He was cursed with the foresight to understand the catastrophic cost of the conflict, an emotional burden he carried in private. The decision to launch D-Day was an act of profound mental discipline, requiring him to suppress the inevitable horror for the sake of the greater strategic imperative. He was addicted to the need to be the calming, rational centre of the storm. When he moved to the presidency, this psychological pattern continued. He viewed the office as the necessary continuation of his wartime duty, an effort to manage the complexities of the Cold War and prevent the world from descending into the chaos he had so recently mastered. He found purpose in maintaining global balance, constantly battling the same forces of extremism and short-sightedness he saw during the war. Eisenhower's final, powerful warning against the military-industrial complex was the ultimate expression of a commander who had seen the addiction to war not just in individuals, but in the institutional structure of the state itself. His story reveals the immense personal cost of being the one who must launch the necessary war, and the subsequent lifetime spent trying to ensure that the instruments of war he commanded never become an end in themselves. The final defence, Boudica, a muddy, rain-soaked settlement, the scent of wood smoke and defiance. Boudica's addiction was a pure, consuming thirst for vengeance and survival. Her struggle was born of a personal trauma and a primal need to protect her people from annihilation. The war was not a strategy for power, but a final, necessary act of self-definition against an overwhelming, occupying force. The psychological drive of her command was absolute, rooted in the clarity of desperation. There was no political ambiguity, no hope of compromise. There was only the total, uncompromising commitment to fight until the end. This made the decision-making simple and pure, a profound form of meaning found in the ultimate act of resistance. She was addicted to the unity and shared sacrifice that only an existential crisis could create. Her psychological reward was the temporary return of her own dignity and authority, which had been brutally stripped away by the Romans. Leading the revolt was an act of personal reclamation, finding self-worth in the sheer force of her defiance. The chaotic energy of the uprising became her natural environment, a place where her rage was transformed into power and her trauma into leadership. This intensity, however, made moderation impossible. She was unable to transition from the fury of a desperate revolt to a sustainable campaign. Her strategic decisions were driven by emotion and the need for immediate cathartic destruction, rather than the cool logic of a long war. The addiction was to the rush of the initial overwhelming success, which ultimately blinded her to the necessity of planning for the final Roman counterattack. Boudica's final, decisive defeat was an inevitable conclusion to a fight born of pure desperation. She chose to die rather than be captured, the ultimate refusal to surrender the dignity and meaning she had reclaimed in battle. Her story is a stark testament to the way trauma can bind a leader to the necessity of conflict, making the fight for survival the only possible form of existence, even when the chance of victory is gone. The mirror of the enemy, Chow Chow, Three Kingdoms. A small boat on a misty river, the tension palpable in the air. Chow Chow's addiction was to the game of strategy, where the enemy was not merely an obstacle, but a necessary intellectual sparring partner. He found profound meaning in the complex, ever-shifting rivalries of the Three Kingdoms period, where the high stakes demanded constant, razor-sharp innovation and profound psychological insight into his opponents. His psychological reward was the validation of his intelligence. He was addicted to being the one who could see 3 steps ahead, who could manipulate the political and military landscape with brilliant, often ruthless subtlety. This provided him with an unparalleled sense of self-worth. The war was the only environment where his unique genius for strategy and human nature could be fully expressed and rewarded. The long-term rivalry with his major opponents became a crucial psychological dynamic. They were the necessary mirror, the only worthy challenge that prevented his strategic mind from growing dull. He could not completely destroy them, because their existence validated his own continuous need for mastery. The fight became a self-sustaining cycle, where the pursuit of ultimate victory was secondary to the pleasure of the ongoing intricate contest. This relentless focus on strategy made him profoundly distrustful and isolated. He often suffered from headaches and sleeplessness, the physical manifestation of a mind that could never rest from the burden of constant calculation. The war provided his life with an immense, structural purpose, but it also robbed him of the capacity for simple, human trust or peace. Every relationship was viewed through the lens of potential strategic advantage. Cao Cao's final years were spent solidifying his domain, but never achieving total, unifying victory. He died striving for a final, perfect closure to the strategic game he had played for decades. His story is a powerful illustration of the addiction to the intellectual challenge of war, where the enemy is not hated but needed, and meaning is found in the relentless, intricate dance of strategic competition, even at the expense of true peace. The Prisoner of the Past, Sherman. A quiet retirement study, the silence interrupted by phantom sounds of battle. William T. Sherman's addiction was to the clarity of action required by total war, but his struggle was with its terrible, enduring cost. He was a brilliant but emotionally volatile man who found in the war's objectives a rationale for his own ruthlessness, a moral necessity that justified the awful destruction he orchestrated. The psychological impact of his march to the sea was a profound moral injury. He believed in the efficacy of his methods, that a swift, brutal end to the conflict saved more lives in the long run. But the memory of the destruction became a heavy psychological burden. He was addicted to the military logic that rationalized the horror, needing to constantly defend his actions to maintain his own moral coherence. When the war ended, the chaos he had unleashed followed him. He found the post-war world of political and social debate frustratingly illogical and sentimental. His mind, accustomed to the decisive command of the battlefield, could not tolerate the slow, ambiguous compromises of peace. He found meaning in the strict discipline of military structure, which he pursued fiercely, attempting to impose order onto the chaotic emotional terrain of his own heart. The psychological difficulty of retirement was the inability to escape the haunting memory of the war. The silence of his study was filled with the spectral noise of marching armies and burning cities. He spent his final years defending his reputation, trapped by the past, constantly reliving the traumatic choices he made. He could not stop arguing the necessity of his actions, because doing so was the only way to retain his sense of purpose. Sherman's life shows the profound tragedy of a commander addicted to the logic of total war. He achieved the strategic goal, but the psychological cost was a life spent as a prisoner of his own success. He was a man who wanted peace, but his chosen method of achieving it, uncompromising devastation, left him forever incapable of truly experiencing it. The silence of his retirement was not empty. It was filled with the unceasing echo of destruction. The longing for rest. George Washington. The gentle slopes of Mount Vernon, the sun setting on a long, arduous journey. After 8 years leading the Continental Army, George Washington faced the final, most terrifying battle, the confrontation with the void of peace. He had been the axis of a revolution, the symbol of an entire nation's will. Now the expectation was that he would simply retire, trade the sword for the plough, and be content with the quiet life of a farmer. But the psychological transition from absolute power to domestic obscurity is rarely simple. Washington's unique form of addiction to war was not rooted in a lust for blood, but in a profound sense of responsibility and duty. The war had given him an unimpeachable moral structure, a clear, grand purpose that transcended personal desire. He found meaning in the self-sacrifice required to lead the struggling cause, a structure that neatly organized his inner life. Without the war, he had to confront the more complex, ambiguous demands of being simply a man. The ultimate choice to lay down his command, surrendering his sword to Congress, was a public act of integrity, but a private act of profound psychological effort. It was a conscious rejection of the ultimate temptation, to trade his hard-won role as a virtuous leader for the easy comfort of a military dictator. He knew his character was being tested not by musket balls, but by the subtle, consuming pull of absolute power, the addiction to being indispensable. At Mount Vernon, he was surrounded by peace, yet often felt an intense, disquieting restlessness. His journals from this period show a man attempting to fill a vacuum of purpose with the minutiae of farming and business. The sounds of rustling leaves and flowing water were a stark contrast to the roar of cannon, and the transition required a deliberate daily recommitment to the value of simplicity. It was a different kind of discipline, the effort required to appreciate small, quiet victories. Washington's life whispers the greatest lesson in overcoming the addiction to conflict, that true enduring meaning is found in the restraint of power, not its exercise. He modelled the psychological maturity required to step away when the fight was done, choosing the peace of his home over the clamour of a continued command. He traded the fleeting high of leadership for the deep, abiding satisfaction of a quiet conscience, finally earning the rest he had fought so long to secure for others. As George Washington, the general who finally chose rest over command, watches the final peaceful sunset over his beloved lands, his journey mirrors a choice we all face. Where do we find our true, lasting meaning? The generals we explored were bound by the very things they sought: purpose, control, identity. The addiction to war was, at its heart, a misdirected search for a profound purpose, a desperate attempt to find inner calm in the violent landscape of the outer world. Now we turn inward. Picture now your mind as a tranquil night sky. The thoughts that rush in, the worries about tomorrow's battles, the anxieties over yesterday's defeats, these are merely the clouds passing overhead. Like the generals, your mind is seeking solutions, seeking control, but it is doing so at too high a speed. Allow the pace of the narration, the slow, steady rhythm of the historical whispers, to guide your thoughts to a necessary stillness. There is no need for conquest here. Find a comfortable position, feeling the weight of your body supported. Let the muscles that have been tense, the shoulders, the jaw, the hands, soften and release their command. Like Washington stepping down from his post, you are consciously choosing to lay down the burden of constant action and vigilance. You are surrendering your mind to the quiet authority of the present moment. This moment is not empty. It is filled with deep restorative peace. Imagine yourself walking slowly toward a quiet hearth, the gentle scent of wood smoke a comforting presence. The fire is not a raging conflagration of war, but a controlled warm glow, a symbol of your inner life, burning steadily and gently. All the struggles for control, all the battles you fought today, can be left outside the door. Your purpose tonight is simple and profound: to allow the body and mind to completely unwind, to return to their natural state of deep calm. The universal thread that binds these historical figures to us is the persistent search for meaning. They sought it in the grandeur of war. We can find it in the quiet strength of rest. Every breath you take is a deliberate act of withdrawing your energy from the external world and directing it inward toward your own personal sanctuary of peace. Breathe in slowly, the air clean and cool. Breathe out completely, releasing any final tension. Feel the quiet dignity of simply existing, without the need for struggle or success. The general's ambition was the drive to be remembered, but the greatest gift is the ability to simply be in the present moment, perfectly forgotten by the demands of the world. Allow the gentle fading of these stories to act as a profound permission slip. Permission to stop planning, stop executing, and simply sink into the comfort of your resting place. Your mind is calm now. Your body is heavy and relaxed. You are safe. You are at peace. The great figures of history, from Alexander to Washington, have faded into the past. Their struggles are testament to the powerful human desire for purpose. And now, that purpose has been fulfilled for you. The journey is complete, and the deep restorative quiet of sleep is here. Let the final words gently carry you across the threshold into profound rest. History's souls, from Caesar's relentless strategy to Washington's ultimate restraint, sought meaning through adversity, each struggle illuminating the universal human quest for purpose. Their wars remind us that the greatest victory is the one we achieve over our own restlessness. As their stories now fade completely, let your own final thoughts settle, carried by the deep, profound stillness of the past. May their struggles bring you peace. Let the silence be your command. Sleep deeply, and may your dreams be a gentle, quiet landscape.